Genshin Impact is and continues to be one of the biggest video games of all time. After grossing nearly 3.7 billion in its first year and continuing to gross hundreds of millions of dollars every single month, even after being released for 3.5 years. To the outside spectator then, one might assume that it has many long-term systems to keep players around and engaged. Those of you in the know realize that the endgame state of Genshin is one of constant criticism and complaint for hardcore players, content creators, and a large portion of the online community. I'm going to talk about the way Genshin's 4 main endgame systems fail, and I'm going to talk about why they fail on purpose to support the real secret 5th type of endgame content that you didn't even realize you were playing and that keeps you coming back patch after patch. The first endgame we're going to talk about is the Spiral Abyss. This is what people generally refer to as the Genshin endgame. This is the hardest combat content in the game, and a good chunk of the game is all about building up your characters, making them stronger. And players of most RPGs that are about team building, character strength, will eventually head into the hardest content in the game to test their strength and see if they can beat it. The reason why the Spiral Abyss fails for most people is because after you 36 star for the very first time, you get an amazing rush. You just worked so hard playing the game for so many hours, exploring so many regions, leveling up your characters, going from defeating tiny hilly trolls in Mondstadt to defeating huge epic bosses in the very hardest endgame, and finally filling out all of those stars. The problem comes that now that you've built up your characters, the next time you go to fight the Spiral Abyss, you've already done it. There's not the same rush as there was before. But maybe there's an Abyss reset, there's new enemies, maybe you get the rush once or twice again, but eventually that sweet, satisfactory feeling of clearing the hardest content goes away, and you're left putting in some amount of effort, depending on how strong your account is at this point, to get really not very many Primo Gem rewards. And worse, the easy floors give you the same rewards as the hard floors, so people who really care about the combat can feel a bit let down that the very easy floor 9 gives you the same rewards as floor 12. It feels like your accomplishment isn't really rewarded. Add this to the fact that there's no leaderboards, there isn't even a time tracker to beat your best time, and there's no reason to play the Spiral Abyss once you've finished it, except for maybe to test out different characters or to get the new rewards when it resets. And because this is the only challenging combat content in the game, many players are left unsatisfied. So why is this by design? If there were too many great rewards at the end of the game, players who don't care as much about the combat content would start to feel like the game isn't for them. And while I don't necessarily agree with this take, this is the most popular theory as to why harder and harder combat content isn't added. But the second reason is that even if harder and harder content was added or more rewards were added, unless there was a fundamental reshape of how the Spiral Abyss works, the same problems would always exist. Just because you give 300 Primo Gems doesn't make it suddenly satisfying, or 1,000. Yes, of course it would be nice, but it would also serve to alienate players who couldn't achieve it, and it might also label the game as pay to win, which would damage the game's reputation. No, the game is designed, plus the data shows, at least to the best that we can figure out, that the vast majority of players do not even attempt the hardest floors, and if they do, they don't attempt it very often and they don't do very well. So the game intentionally allocates its resources to things that most players actually will engage with, especially since the game doesn't make any money in particular from the Spiral Abyss. Plus, the primary target audience and revenue from the game comes from the Chinese server, and this is a demographic of players, especially the paying players, that favor shorter, completable challenges that don't require a huge time investment, because most of them are playing on their breaks, on the bus, and there's actually a mandatory limit to how many hours a week children can play video games. So making the game too hardcore might serve to alienate the very people that they made the game for. But that's not the only endgame we have. There's 3 more types of endgame we have to talk about that also fail on purpose before we talk about the real Genshin endgame that very much succeeds. Endgame number 2 is the Serenity Pot. The Serenity Pot is the game's house building and farming system. You can enjoy your characters in incredible landscapes, craft your favorite scenes, increase friendship with your characters, and even achieve valuable resources for your work. But unfortunately, the teapot fails as an endgame system too. Although it caters to a completely different demographic, the teapot was one of my wife's favorite things when we were both playing the game together regularly. The hardcore teapot players also have major challenges. The main one being the load limit, greatly restricting how much you can actually do and very much restricting creativity. This one is arguably not by design, as the game has to support mobile limitations, which is of course fair enough, although it would be nice if the limitations were released if you do play on PC, but I understand them not wanting to make mobile players feel like second-class citizens when they contribute so much to the game's revenue. But the real failure of the teapot as endgame is it is more or less a one and done system. Yes, you do receive ongoing rewards, and the mode is updated very frequently, with every single patch bringing new little gadgets and things you can craft to expand your teapot, new regions bringing new areas, and always having fun little things that are brand new and that are added, as well as rewards that you can consistently claim. But even with all this stuff that's being added on an ongoing basis, it still is essentially one and done, unless you have a personal goal to always change things up. Once you collect all the rewards, you're kind of set, and all you have to do is collect your rewards every week. And there is a reason for this as well. If they made new teapot challenges and new things that you had to do and to achieve the rewards, and it wasn't just a one and done, then players that are not very into the teapot building system would feel pressured and forced to engage with it when they don't really want to. And when, again, it's targeted towards busy people who don't have a ton of time, it is by design that the teapot system is designed to fail. But it's not the last time that Genshin added a casual mode that was forgotten about by the majority of the player base. Genius Invocation TCG was added during the Sumeru update and has received a huge amount of support every single patch, with new challenges, new cards, and an ever-expanding meta, and yet most players do not engage with the system at all, with many even forgetting that it exists. Yet there is still a dedicated fan base, and the game is definitely an endgame mode with the amount of support it receives every single patch, with new cards, new events being added all the time. The reason why most people would say that this endgame mode fails is because of how little it's connected to the actual game. The characters that you build don't have any attachment to the cards that you play with in the game. You don't see your characters, you don't use your character stats, and aside from the first time rewards, you don't earn any ongoing rewards for the game by playing or interacting with the TCG. And as such, players may choose to either not interact with the TCG at all, or get the one-time rewards and then forget about it forever. The game also has no leaderboards, so unless you're prolific with online communities to keep up with some sort of tournaments, all you're left is random online matchmaking, which can get stale pretty fast. In addition, and I think that this is a much bigger problem, the game has no separate app and requires you to get all the way to AR32 to even interact with. So the game is highly unlikely to attract dedicated TCG players, as those players are unlikely to slog through all the way through AR32 just to unlock this mode. But there is a reason for this. The TCG is designed to fail in this way too. It's not connected to the main game, again, so players that don't have a ton of time don't feel pressured to engage with this mode. And I think it's very much intentional that AR32 is where it's locked behind. Number one, so it doesn't intimidate new players. And number two, I don't think Genshin wants players to download Genshin Impact just to play the TCG. And I don't think they want to start a separate app, at least at this point. It could be that it's a testing ground for a later separate app, or it could be that they just want this to be an activity that Genshin Impact players do, not an activity that hardcore players do, even if they don't like Genshin Impact. Hardcore TCG players, which is definitely emphasized by the fact that there's no leaderboard. Couple this with the fact that there is no monetization attached to the TCG, and same with the teapot. These are specifically designed so that they're enjoyable, but also carefully made so that they're not an entire game in and of themselves. They don't want people to be pressured to have to play these modes every single day or week. The final endgame mode, before we go into the real secret endgame, is exploration. Now, you might not call this endgame because you can technically finish it and there's no chest respawning and things don't reset. However, they do release brand new exploration areas very, very consistently. And this is definitely a mainstay for a lot of players, that they like to enjoy the exploration. These new areas, however, also fail. And the reason why is because in the beginning, you really enjoy exploration because the resources you get are relevant to your character upgrades. The difficulty is relatively balanced with your character strength. For example, going to Dragonspine is very difficult. I think if you were to start a new game right now, and if you hadn't played before, playing through the entire map, especially some of those harder enemies and harder bosses, is actually relatively challenging, very engaging, and extremely fun. And one day I do want to replay all of Genshin Impact, maybe before Snezhnaya comes out, because I do think playing through the story and exploring the world is very enjoyable. But once you reach endgame, all the bosses and mobs are trivial as defeating this little bunny. Alright, technically it wasn't a bunny, it was something else. But what I'm saying is the more you push into the actual Genshin endgame, the more trivial exploration becomes. And as such, when a new area comes out like the Chenyu Vale, those who enjoy puzzles are really, really hyped. Those who enjoy story quests are really, really hyped. And I'm one of those people. I really do enjoy exploration in Genshin Impact, and I personally find it very fun. However, I do find it less fun now that no boss or mob can give me a challenge because my levels and artifacts are just too high. In addition, as I've mentioned before, the areas themselves are not replayable, so people who go through it once fairly quickly, if you have a lot of time to actually play and you go through it, then you're potentially left with not much to do after you've finished exploring. This is once again by design, because both of these are by design, because if they were to make the overworld too difficult, then it would scare away new players, and if they were to make it repeatable, they would worry again about the burden for a lot of the players. I do think there are fixes for these things. I do think there are better ways to do these things, but I also do think that this is by design. So if it has all these problems, and even worse, the problems are designed into the game, why on earth are people still playing? Well, first of all, before I go into the real Genshin endgame, I do want to say a few things. Even though each one of the modes I talked about has a lot of problems and are inherently broken and problematic and whatever, they are still very, very fun and very, very good for a lot of people. For me personally, I love testing out lots of new characters in the Abyss, and I find the Abyss very fun, even though others might not. Even though lots of players don't enjoy the teapot, some really, really do and continue to. Even though lots of players played the TCG and then dropped it forever or never touched it to begin with, there is quite a large community that still plays the TCG, and a lot of people, such as myself, still enjoy new areas and the exploration of the game, along with the new stories and everything, very, very much. So even though all those endgame fails, it also succeeds to a lot of players. But the fact is that Genshin doesn't design the game around those aspects succeeding as endgame, and that's because of the secret endgame, the real Genshin endgame, which is character collection. At the end of the day, Genshin is a gacha game. Games are inherently designed, especially in this day and age, to make a profit. Genshin doesn't make profit from the Spiral Abyss. They don't gate new areas behind a paywall. The TCG costs nothing to play. There's no microtransactions in the teapot. All of the money is spent on collecting characters and, believe it or not, building up your characters. A fairly large amount of people spend money on resin for their characters, which I highly don't recommend, by the way. Everything in the game, from exploring new areas to collect Primogems, beating the Spiral Abyss to get Primogems, spending resin, everything in the game, except for weirdly the TCG, which is sort of, once you beat it the first time, it's sort of its own contained loop. Everything else in the game is funneled in towards getting you to care about the characters, collect the characters, and build the characters. It's all about building that juicy artifact stat line for the hardcore players, collecting all of them for completionist players, or showing your dedication to your favorite waifu by getting constellations for them. The real Genshin endgame is about collecting and building characters, and that is the reason why this channel is the way it is. The reason why I build and test every character is because I love the combat system of this game, and I want to have a reason to engage with it. And because the game is designed around crafting these brilliantly designed characters, these brilliantly designed elemental reactions and and weapons and team interactions, and it's just an amazing system. But their business model doesn't work unless people spend money, and people don't spend money on content. They spend money on the characters. The characters are the content, the characters are the end game. And so the way that I get fulfillment from the game, and the reason why, just you might think that I'm down on Genshin for making this video. Genshin's my favorite game of all time. I love Genshin. I'm fully satisfied with Genshin. I do hope that all of those areas could be addressed and all of it could be improved, but I've designed my content and my playstyle of the game in a way that supports the game, the end game loop. And I do hope that they add more co-op stuff. I hope that they add more different types of end game content. I ask for it in every survey. But at the end of the day, if people are spending money on the characters, that is Hoyoverse's bottom line. That is the end game. Get primo gems for character, get resources for character. Get primo gems, get character, get resources. Get primo gems, get character, get resources. That's the end game loop, whether you like it or not. And it's a very successful one. It's one that keeps people coming back whenever there's a new Archon, a new character that people care about. They're coming back to the game for the new content and the end game loop. Let me know if you would agree or disagree. Obviously, this video is an opinion, but if I were to spend the whole video talking about how this is my opinion, blah, 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 it wouldn't be very interesting. So I hope that you know that I know that this is all just my opinion. Of course, this is based on facts and listening to other content creators and being on Reddit and on Twitter and watching other people's takes on this stuff. Whether or not you think that the end game being characters is a good thing or a bad thing, I think it has its pros and cons. I think its pros are that we get great characters because they invest a lot of time and money into designing really well designed characters in a very satisfying and good combat system. The downside is we don't get as much great content to play with them. It's too bad. It's too bad we can't have both. If someone from Genshin watches this, I hope that you know that you can address some of these issues while still keeping the main content loop the same. You can add a couple more endgame modes while also having great design characters. And I know it's I'll tell you what as well, guys, it's very hard to design a good endgame mode. If you go look at other communities, if you go look at WoW, if you go look at Final Fantasy, if you go look at Destiny, they're always complaining about the end. Call of Duty, they're always complaining about the end game. Actually, Call of Duty maybe not as much, but the only games that people don't complain about end game is competitive games, is PvP games. And even then they do complain about, balancing and blah, 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 pay to win, all that stuff. But for a gacha game to have PvP, that just doesn't make any sense. So for me, if I'm done with Genshin and I want to play something else, or if I wish that there is endgame in Genshin, I don't try and get my endgame sweaty, try-hard content from Genshin. I get it from playing Super Smash Brothers, right? I get it from playing Pokemon competitively. I get it from playing games because you can't make bosses that are as engaging as another person. The true sweaty, hardcore endgame comes from outwitting, outplaying, outsmarting another real human being. At least at this point, because bosses just never provide that same ongoing satisfaction. Yeah, maybe one time for one boss, but not for like an endgame loop. You can only fight the same boss so many times. You might have noticed that I conveniently left out the brand new endgame that Genshin is allegedly bringing sometime in the future. It's going to be a permanent user-generated content mode. I have, since I made that first video, confirmed that it is for sure true and that real creators and professional people are being recruited for that new type of endgame mode. I think this mode has a lot of potential, and it has a lot of potential to fix and address some of the things we've talked about today. And I'm honestly very positive about it and very excited for it. I think I pretty much nailed my reaction, and I pretty much have good takes that I agree with up in that video. So go check it out right now. Take care. Bye for now.